The sun hammered down on the expansive stretch of gravel and hard-packed dirt that formed the backbone of the property, baking the clay until it was as hard as concrete under the mid-morning heat. The land was 60 acres of rugged terrain, a mix of dense pine forest and cleared grazing patches that sat on the edge of the county line, a place where the air always smelled of dry pine needles and diesel fumes. The hero stood by the open hood of his 1978 pickup, a machine built from steel and stubbornness, much like the man who owned it, his hands coated in grease as he tightened the alternator belt with a wrench that had seen decades of use. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of a gloved hand, the leather cracked and worn from years of pulling fence wire and hauling timber. The silence of the property was absolute, broken only by the ticking of the cooling engine and the distant, rhythmic call of a crow perched high in a dead oak tree near the eastern boundary. This was his sanctuary, a place purchased with money earned from 40 years of hard labor and dangerous contracting work, a place where he answered to no one and the only schedule that mattered was the rising and setting of the sun. He didn't farm for profit anymore, but he maintained the land with a military discipline, keeping the fire breaks clear and the access roads graded because that was what a responsible landowner did. The road in question, known on the old county maps as Fire Road 9, was a wide, straight shot of crushed rock that ran from the back of his property, cut through the dense woods, and connected to the main county highway 2 miles away. It was an essential artery, a lifeline that allowed heavy equipment, timber trucks, and emergency vehicles to bypass the narrow, winding bridge that served as the main entrance to the valley. For years, that road had been nothing more than a quiet, dusty track used by him and the occasional county surveyor, but things had changed. The land adjacent to his, once a sprawling cattle ranch owned by an old friend who had passed away, had been sold to developers 2 years ago. The earth movers had come first, tearing up the pasture, leveling the hills, and pouring acres of asphalt to create a sprawling, pristine subdivision called Sovereign Estates. The houses had gone up quickly, large, identical structures with perfectly manicured lawns and strict rules about everything from mailbox colors to the length of the grass. The hero had watched it all from his side of the fence, standing silent and stoic as the character of the valley shifted from rural independence to suburban regulation. He had stayed on his side and they had stayed on theirs until today. The sound of a heavy engine, different from his own, cut through the stillness. He looked up from the truck, his eyes narrowing against the glare of the sun. A sleek black luxury SUV was making its way down the edge of Fire Road 9, its tires crunching awkwardly over the large stones that he kept on the road to discourage speeders. The vehicle looked out of place, too clean, too shiny, bouncing violently as the driver navigated the ruts with zero finesse. Behind the SUV, a flatbed truck followed, loaded with heavy timber posts and galvanized steel fencing. The hero didn't move. He simply placed the wrench on the fender of his truck, crossed his arms, and waited. The SUV stopped 20 yards from where the hero stood, right at the invisible line where his property deed ended and the easement for the new subdivision began. The door swung open, and the HOA president stepped out. He was a man who radiated an unearned sense of authority, dressed in a pristine beige suit that looked ridiculous in the dusty heat, his shoes polished to a mirror shine that was already gathering a film of red dust. He adjusted his jacket, looking around with a sneer of distaste at the hero's rusted truck and the pile of brush waiting to be burned. The hero remained motionless, his face a mask of calm observation. The HOA president walked forward, not extending a hand but raising a finger pointing directly at the ground between them. He spoke loudly, his voice projecting as if he were addressing a crowded room rather than a single man in the middle of the woods. He announced that he was the head of the Sovereign Estates Board of Directors and that they had voted on a new security measure. He gestured to the flatbed truck behind him, where 2 younger men in work vests were already unloading post-hole diggers and bags of concrete. The president explained, with a tone that suggested he was speaking to a slow child, that the access road, Fire Road 9, was an eyesore and a security risk. He claimed that unauthorized vehicles were using it to bypass the main gate of the subdivision, disturbing the peace of the residents and lowering property values. He stated that effective immediately, the HOA was exercising its right to control the perimeter of their development. The hero watched him, his eyes shifting from the president's pointing finger to the men unloading the truck. He didn't shout. He didn't argue. He simply stated in a voice like grinding gravel that this was a deeded access road. He pointed to the utility markers on the trees, faded orange blazes that indicated the path of the right-of-way. He told the president that blocking the road was illegal, not just because of access rights, but because it was a designated emergency route. The fire department used this road. The county used this road. It was the only way to get heavy tankers into the backwoods if the dry season sparked a wildfire. The president laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound. He waved his hand, dismissing the hero's words as the ramblings of an old man stuck in the past. He declared that the HOA had jurisdiction over all access points bordering their community and that they had already cleared the closure with their own legal counsel. He shouted at the workers to begin digging. The hero took a step forward, his boots crunching heavily on the ground. The president flinched, stepping back, but the hero didn't attack. He just looked at the surveyor's stakes the men were driving into the ground. They were positioning the gate exactly on the property line, effectively sealing off the hero's exit to the south. The hero warned him one last time. He told him that iron and concrete wouldn't change the law and that once that gate was locked, the liability shifted to the HOA. The president turned red, his composure cracking under the hero's intense, silent stare. He yelled that he didn't care about liability, he cared about the exclusivity of his neighborhood. He pointed his finger aggressively at the hero's chest, shouting that he was tired of seeing junk trucks and biker trash driving past the rear manicured gardens of his board members. He declared that by sunset this road would be closed, and if the hero tried to remove the gate, the HOA would sue him for destruction of private property and have him arrested for trespassing. The hero looked at the president, then at the workers who were nervously avoiding eye contact, and finally at the road itself. It was a critical piece of infrastructure. Without it, a fire in the lower valley would trap everyone on the ridge. The hero turned his back on the president, walking slowly back to his truck. He picked up his wrench and went back to work on the alternator. The dismissal was absolute. The president, furious at being ignored, screamed a few more threats about fines and legal action, then stormed back to his SUV, slamming the door so hard the vehicle shook. The hero worked steadily, the mechanical rhythm of his movements unchanged, even as the sound of the gas-powered auger roared to life behind him. He could hear the blade biting into the earth, the sound of men shouting instructions, the clang of metal poles being dropped into place. He didn't look back, he knew exactly what they were doing. They were digging deep holes, setting heavy-gauge steel posts in quick-drying concrete. They were hanging a reinforced tubular steel gate painted a dull, authoritative green. They were installing a heavy padlock mechanism, one that required a code only the HOA possessed. The sun climbed higher, the heat intensifying, baking the wet concrete as the hours passed. The hero finished his work on the truck, wiped his hands on a rag, and poured himself a cup of water from the cooler in the truck bed. He leaned against the tailgate, finally turning to watch the finished product. The gate was impressive. It spanned the entire width of the road, blocked on the sides by large boulders the workers had rolled into place to prevent anyone from driving around it. It was a fortress wall built to keep the world out, or in this case, to keep the hero in. The workers packed up their tools, casting wary glances at the silent figure by the truck. The HOA president had returned to oversee the final locking. He stood by the new gate, testing the swing, nodding with satisfaction. He looked across the barrier at the hero, a smug grin on his face. He shouted across the distance, asking if the hero liked the new community improvement. He laughed, creating a mocking echo in the quiet woods. The hero didn't respond. He simply memorized the scene. He noted the lack of a Knox box, the rapid entry system the fire department required on all gated access roads. He noted the width of the gate, which looked too narrow for a standard ladder truck. He noted the way the hinges were welded, making them impossible to disassemble. The president got back into his SUV and drove away, the tires kicking up dust that settled on the shiny new gate. The workers followed in the flatbed. The silence returned to the valley, but the atmosphere had changed. The open road was gone. The hero walked down to the gate, stopping a few feet from the steel bars. He reached out and touched the metal. It was hot from the sun. He gripped one of the bars, testing its solidity. It didn't budge. It was a professional job, expensive and permanent. He looked through the bars at the subdivision beyond. He could see the back of a large house, a swimming pool, a manicured lawn. He saw a man in a polo shirt mowing the grass, completely oblivious to the violation of law that had just occurred a few hundred yards away. The hero knew the history of this land better than anyone. He knew that 50 years ago, the county had mandated this road as a condition for any development in the sector because of the high wildfire risk in the Pine Barrens. He knew that the deed to his property contained specific language about unfettered access regarding the southern easement. He knew that the HOA had just committed a felony, likely several. But he also knew that fighting a wealthy HOA in civil court was exactly what they wanted. They wanted to drain his bank account with motions and delays until he gave up or died. They operated on the assumption that money was power and that rules were for people who couldn't afford lawyers. The hero turned away from the gate and walked back to his house, a sturdy log structure built on a rise overlooking the valley. He went inside his office, a room lined with filing cabinets and maps. He didn't go for a gun, he went for a file. He pulled out a thick, dust-covered folder labeled Land Surveys and Easements 1985 Present. He opened it, spreading the large, yellowed papers out on his desk. He traced the lines with a rough finger. There it was. The easement was clear. But there was something else, something he had almost forgotten. A rider attached to the original subdivision plat from the 1970s before the HOA even existed. It referenced the County Fire Marshal Authority and a specific statute regarding impediment of life-saving apparatus. The hero sat back in his chair, the leather creaking. The HOA president thought this was a property dispute. He thought it was about aesthetics and exclusivity. He had no idea he had just started a war with the Department of Public Safety. The hero picked up his landline phone, the old rotary dial clicking as he entered a number. He didn't call a lawyer. He called the direct line of an old friend, a man he had served with years ago, a man who was now the county fire marshal. The phone rang 3 times before a gruff male voice answered. The hero spoke calmly, succinctly. He told the marshal that he had a code violation to report, a serious one. He gave the coordinates. He mentioned the gate. He mentioned the lack of a Knox box. He mentioned the dead-end trap the HOA had just created for their own residents. The marshal on the other end went silent for a moment, then asked if the road was completely blocked. The hero confirmed it. The marshal's voice dropped an octave, the tone shifting from casual to professional fury. He said he would be there in the morning. The hero hung up. He looked out the window at the setting sun, casting long shadows over the trees. The gate was a problem, yes, but it was also a trap. The HOA had built a cage, thinking they were locking the hero out, but they had actually locked themselves in with a force of nature they didn't understand. The hero walked to the kitchen, poured a black coffee, and walked out to his porch. He sat in his rocking chair, watching the light fade from the sky. Down the hill, the streetlights of sovereign estates flickered on, little pinpricks of artificial light in the encroaching darkness. He could see the silhouette of the new gate against the twilight. It stood as a monument to arrogance. The hero took a sip of coffee. He wasn't angry anymore, he was focused. The escalation had begun, but the enemy had made a fatal tactical error. They had assumed the law was a tool they could wield or ignore at their leisure. They forgot that some laws were written in blood and ash, and the men who enforced them didn't care about property values or beige suits. The hero waited for the morning. The sun would rise, and with it, the reckoning. The peaceful routine was broken, but the path to justice had just been paved, right over their brand new gate. The following morning brought no relief from the heat. The sun rising like a white-hot welder's arc over the eastern ridge, instantly burning off the dew and heating the steel of the new gate until it was painful to touch. The hero, dressed in his unvarying uniform of a sleeveless denim vest that exposed the faded ink on his weathered arms, a bandana tied tight across his forehead, and heavy biker boots that crunched on the gravel, stood on his side of the barrier. He wore his motorcycle gloves, the leather molding to his hands like a second skin, as he inspected the obstruction with the cold, detached eye of a man assessing structural damage. The gate was secure, the hinges welded shut, the padlock a heavy-duty model that gleamed mockingly in the sunlight. Beyond the bars, life in sovereign estates proceeded with a surreal, manicured calmness, electric golf carts buzzing silently along the paved paths while sprinklers hissed in rhythmic pulses. The contrast between the raw, dusty reality of the hero's land and the artificial perfection of the subdivision was starker than ever. He wasn't alone for long. The sound of tires on asphalt heralded the arrival of the HOA tyrant, who pulled up in his black SUV on the subdivision's side, parking diagonally to block the view of the manicured lawn behind him. He stepped out, the beige suit looking even more incongruous against the backdrop of the rugged forest, his face already twisted into a mask of aggressive triumph. He didn't come to negotiate, he came to dominate. He marched to the bars, gripping them with soft hands, and immediately began shouting, his voice shrill and piercing. He pointed a finger directly at the hero's face through the gaps in the steel, accusing him of loitering near private community property. He yelled that the board had met late last night and passed an emergency resolution declaring a visual buffer zone that extended 50 feet into the hero's property. He claimed the hero's brush pile, his parked truck, and even the hero himself were aesthetic violations that lowered the property value of the homes visible through the gate. The hero stood his ground, silent, his arms crossed over his chest, his eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses, watching the tyrant's performance with the patience of a stone. The tyrant reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick envelope, shoving it through the bars. It fell into the dust at the hero's feet. The tyrant shouted that those were fines, $500 a day for the truck, $200 for the brush, and a cease and desist order regarding the use of the access road. He screamed that their lawyers had filed an injunction to prevent the hero from tampering with the gate, framing it as a critical security asset. The hero looked down at the envelope but didn't pick it up. He knew what was inside: legal bullying, baseless threats designed to scare someone who didn't know their rights. But the hero knew exactly where the property line was, and he knew the buffer zone was a fiction invented by a man drunk on petty power. The tyrant, infuriated by the lack of reaction, rattled the gate, shouting that he would have the sheriff out here to arrest the hero for harassment if he didn't move his junk immediately. He pointed again, stabbing the air, his face contorted with the effort of projecting his authority. Just then, a deep rumble shook the ground, a sound far heavier and more authoritative than the tyrant's SUV or the hero's pickup. A large red Ford F-350, marked with the official seal of the county fire marshal and equipped with a heavy brush guard and emergency lights, crunched up the gravel road from the hero's side of the property. The vehicle stopped a few feet behind the hero, the dust settling around its massive tires. The driver's door opened and the fire marshal stepped out. He was a big man built like a linebacker, wearing a gray uniform shirt with a gold badge that caught the sun, and dark cargo pants tucked into polished tactical boots. He walked with a heavy, deliberate gait, ignoring the hero for a moment to focus entirely on the gate. He carried a clipboard and a heavy tape measure. The tyrant stopped yelling, his mouth hanging open for a second before he recovered his arrogant sneer. He assumed this was some local buddy of the hero coming to intimidate him, not realizing the jurisdictional weight that had just arrived. The marshal walked up to the gate, the hero stepping aside to let him work. The marshal didn't say a word. He extended the tape measure, checking the width of the gate. He checked the ground clearance. He checked the locking mechanism. He took a digital camera from his belt and snapped several high-resolution photos of the hinges, the lock, and the lack of a Knox box. He then photographed the boulders blocking the bypass. Finally, he looked up at the tyrant, who was now leaning against the bars, looking bored and dismissive. The marshal asked in a flat, gravelly voice who authorized the installation of this obstruction. The tyrant laughed, a sharp, barking sound. He puffed out his chest, pointed at his own name tag, and declared that he authorized it as the president of the Sovereign Estates HOA and that he had full authority to secure the perimeter of his community. He told the marshal to get off private property. The marshal stared at him, his expression unchanging, and informed him that he was standing on a designated fire access road, Fire Road 9, which was under the jurisdiction of the county and the state fire code. He stated calmly that the gate was a violation of Code 503.6, Security Gates and Barriers, and Code 50321, Dimensions. He explained that by locking this gate without a rapid entry system, the HOA was endangering lives. The tyrant exploded. He screamed that he didn't care about some obscure code and that his bylaws superseded county recommendations. He pointed his finger at the marshal now, a fatal mistake, yelling that the HOA paid more in taxes than the fire department's entire budget and that he wouldn't be bullied by a glorified meter maid. He threatened to call the mayor, claiming he had personal connections that would have the marshal's badge on a desk by the afternoon. The marshal didn't blink. He wrote something on his clipboard, ripped off a pink carbon copy, and handed it through the bars. The tyrant refused to take it, so the marshal let it drop to the ground next to the hero's envelope. The marshal stated that this was a notice of violation. The HOA had 48 hours to remove the obstruction or install a compliant Knox box and widen the clearance. Failure to comply would result in daily fines starting at $5,000 and potential criminal negligence charges. The tyrant kicked dirt at the citation, screaming that he would see them in court and that no one was touching his gate. He yelled that his lawyers would bury the county in paperwork for a decade before a single bolt was removed. He turned his back on them, marching to his SUV, and drove off, leaving the engine revving high as he sped away. The hero and the marshal stood in the silence left by the tyrant's departure. The marshal looked at the hero and shook his head, a grim smile touching his lips. He told the hero that he had seen this type before, men who thought a title in a neighborhood club gave them the power of a king. He warned the hero that the tyrant wasn't going to back down, he was going to escalate. The marshal explained that the 48-hour window was a legal formality, but he couldn't physically tear the gate down himself without a court order or an active fire emergency. The system was slow, and men like the tyrant knew how to jam the gears. The hero nodded. He understood. He told the marshal he could handle the weight. The marshal clapped a hand on the hero's shoulder, told him to keep his head down, and got back in his truck, reversing down the long gravel drive. The hero was left alone again with the gate. He bent down and picked up the pink citation slip, dusting it off. He folded it carefully and put it in his vest pocket. He left the tyrant's envelope in the dirt. The heat of the day was peaking, the air shimmering off the ground. The hero went back to his work, but the dynamic had shifted. The HOA wasn't just fighting a neighbor anymore. They were fighting the safety of the entire region, and they had just declared war on the one agency that had the power to shut them down completely. However, the tyrant wasn't idle. Within hours, the escalation began in earnest. A private security patrol car, a cheap sedan with yellow lights, began parking on the other side of the gate. The guard inside, a young man who looked bored and hot, sat there facing the hero's property, a visible sentinel meant to intimidate. The hero ignored him. Then came the noise. From the HOA side, a landscaping crew arrived, not to cut grass, but to operate leaf blowers right at the property line, aiming the debris and dust through the fence onto the hero's land. It was petty, childish harassment designed to provoke a reaction. The hero simply put on ear protection and continued splitting logs, the rhythmic crack of the maul hitting the wood acting as a counterbeat to the whining engines. He was disciplined. He was observant. He saw the security guard taking photos of him every time he moved. He saw the drone hovering high above the tree line, buzzing like a giant hornet, filming his property, looking for anything they could report: an oil spill, an unpermitted shed, a pile of tires. They were looking for leverage. The hero went inside his shop and covered his equipment with tarps. He moved his fuel cans into the locked barn. He cleaned his yard with military precision. He gave them nothing. By late afternoon, a courier truck arrived at the hero's main entrance, which opened onto the county highway miles away. The driver delivered a certified letter. The hero opened it on the hood of his truck. It was a legal notice from a high-priced law firm representing the HOA. They were suing him for loss of enjoyment and harassment, claiming his report to the fire marshal was a malicious act intended to damage the reputation of the community. They were seeking damages of $50,000. They also included a settlement offer. If the hero signed over a 20-foot easement along the fence line to the HOA for landscaping and security purposes and agreed to drop all complaints, they would waive the lawsuit. The hero read the letter twice. It was a land grab. They didn't just want to block the road, they wanted to own it. They wanted to expand their territory inch by inch. The hero walked into his house and added the letter to the file on his desk, placing it next to the original deed and the fire marshal's contact info. He wasn't scared, he was calculating. The tyrant was overplaying his hand. By filing a lawsuit, he was putting the matter on public record. He was inviting a judge to look at the maps. The sun began to dip, casting long shadows through the pine trees. The security guard at the gate turned on his amber flashing lights, a pulsing annoyance in the twilight. The hero walked out to the edge of his porch. He could see the lights of the tyrant's house, the biggest one on the ridge, blazing like a cruise ship. The tyrant was probably in there, drinking expensive scotch, telling his wife how he had crushed the biker trash next door. He had no idea that the trash was a man who had cleared this land by hand, a man who knew every inch of soil, every drainage ditch, and every legal corner marker. The hero knew something else too. He knew that the land the HOA was built on had a history of drainage issues. He knew that the developers had cut corners on the grading to fit more houses in. And he knew that Fire Road 9 wasn't just a road. It sat on top of a critical culvert system that managed the runoff from the By blocking the road with heavy concrete footings, they hadn't just blocked traffic, they had potentially blocked the water. The hero grabbed a flashlight and walked down to the creek bed that ran parallel to the road. It was dry now, just a bed of stones, but if it rained, and in this valley when it rained it poured, that water would have nowhere to go. The hero shone his light on the new concrete base of the gate posts. They were massive, sunk deep. They went right through where the old drainage pipe should have been. The hero smiled for the first time that day. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of a man who just found the loose thread that would unravel the entire sweater. He turned off the light and walked back to the house in the dark. The security guard watched him go, unaware that the man he was guarding against wasn't the threat. The threat was the sky and the physics of water and the arrogance of men who thought they could build walls across nature. The 48-hour deadline was ticking. The tyrant would ignore it. The fines would start, the lawsuit would proceed. But the hero had a new card to play, one that didn't require a lawyer. He just needed the weather to turn. He checked the barometer on his wall. The pressure was dropping. A summer storm was brewing over the mountains. The escalation was over. The crisis was approaching. The tyrant wanted a war over a road. He was about to get a war with the mountain itself. The hero sat in his chair, cleaning his gloves, waiting for the rain. The silence of the house was heavy, filled with the tension of the coming storm. The battle lines were drawn in steel and concrete, but the victory would be decided by mud and gravity. The hero was ready. The 48-hour deadline imposed by the fire marshal came and went with the grinding inevitability of a glacier. But instead of compliance, it brought a heavy, suffocating silence that hung over the valley like a shroud. The heat had broken, replaced by a thick, oppressive humidity that made the air feel heavy enough to swim in, the sky turning a bruised shade of purple-gray as massive thunderheads began to stack up against the western mountains. The hero, standing on his porch in his sleeveless denim vest which revealed the faded ink of eagles and anchors on his weathered arms, adjusted his bandana and watched the gate. He expected the marshal to return with bolt cutters and a citation book, but the bureaucracy of the county was a slow-moving beast, and the HOA tyrant knew exactly how to exploit every sluggish gear in the machine. At exactly 900 hours, a convoy of vehicles appeared on the HOA side of the barrier, but they weren't construction trucks to remove the gate. Leading the pack was the tyrant's black SUV, followed closely by a county sheriff's cruiser and a white van marked Rapid Process Servers. The hero walked down the gravel drive, his heavy biker boots sinking slightly into the dust that was waiting for the rain. He stopped 10 yards from the gate, his face a mask of disciplined calm, though his eyes were sharp and assessing. The tyrant stepped out first, his beige suit immaculate despite the threatening weather, his shoes gleaming. He didn't look worried about the fire marshal's order, he looked ecstatic. He held a sheaf of papers in his hand, waving them in the air like a weapon. A deputy, a younger man who looked uncomfortable being caught in the middle of a rich man's feud, stepped out of the cruiser and approached the gate. The tyrant pointed a manicured finger at the hero, shouting that the aggressor was present and that the papers should be served immediately. The process server, a man with a tired face, slipped the documents through the bars of the gate. The hero picked them up. It wasn't just a lawsuit anymore, it was a temporary restraining order and a preliminary injunction. The text was dense with legal jargon, but the message was clear. The HOA had successfully petitioned a judge, claiming that the hero had made terroristic threats against the community leadership and that his insistence on accessing the private security perimeter constituted an immediate danger to the residents. The injunction forbade the hero from coming within 10 feet of the gate, from touching the locking mechanism, or from interfering with community infrastructure projects. Tyrant laughed, a high barking sound that grated against the low rumble of distant thunder. He yelled that his lawyers had found a sympathetic judge, one who played golf at the same club, and that the biker trash was now legally boxed in. He screamed that if the hero so much as scratched the paint on the gate, he would be arrested for contempt of court. The deputy looked at the hero and apologized, stating he was just there to ensure the peace was kept while the order was served. The hero didn't argue. He knew that arguing with a deputy on the side of the road was a losing battle. He nodded once, acknowledging the order, and took a step back. The tyrant, emboldened by the hero's retreat, signaled to the third vehicle in his convoy, a heavy-duty dump truck that had been waiting just out of sight. The truck backed up to the gate, its reverse alarm beeping steadily. The tyrant shouted over the noise, explaining with glee that since the security perimeter was now legally protected, they were going to reinforce it. The dump truck raised its bed and unleashed tons of heavy, jagged riprap, large boulders and sharp stones, piling them up directly against the gate on the HOA side. They weren't just blocking the road, they were burying it. The stones crashed down, creating a 3-foot-high berm that effectively sealed the bottom of the gate and, more critically, completely covered the area where the drainage swale used to be. The hero watched the rocks fall, his jaw tightening. He knew exactly what that meant. They were damming the natural water flow. He tried to speak to the deputy, pointing at the rocks and the darkening sky, mentioning the drainage. The deputy just shrugged, saying civil engineering wasn't his jurisdiction and that he had to go. The cruiser backed away, leaving the hero alone with the tyrant and his wall of stone. The tyrant stood atop the pile of rocks, looking down at the hero like a conqueror on a rampart. He pointed his finger, his face red with the exertion of yelling, and screamed that this was what happened when people didn't know their place. He declared that he was going to starve the hero out, that he would make the property so inaccessible and miserable that the hero would beg to sell it for pennies on the dollar. The hero turned his back and walked to his truck. He needed to get to town, to the bank, to his lawyer. He drove the long way around, taking the rough logging trail that connected to the highway miles to the north, a 40-minute detour. When he arrived at the local bank, a place where he had done business for 30 years, the teller looked at him with sympathetic eyes but shook her head. She turned the screen around. His accounts were frozen. Pending litigation lien. The HOA's lawyers had filed an emergency motion attaching his assets to the $50,000 lawsuit, claiming he was a flight risk and likely to liquidate his assets to avoid payment. The hero stood in the quiet lobby, the air conditioning humming, his leather gloves gripping the counter edge until the knuckles turned white. He had zero access to his funds. No gas money, no money for a retainer. He was financially paralyzed. He walked out of the bank, the first drops of rain hitting the dusty pavement. It wasn't a sprinkle, it was the heavy, fat drops that signaled a deluge. He drove back to his property, the windshield wipers slapping a frantic rhythm against the glass. By the time he reached his land, the sky had opened up. The storm wasn't just a summer shower, it was a cloudburst, a massive volume of water dumping onto the valley in minutes. The dry, hard-packed earth couldn't absorb it fast enough. The water began to run, seeking the lowest point, finding the old channels carved by centuries of erosion. The hero parked his truck in the barn and stood in the doorway, watching the water rise. His property sat in a shallow bowl at the base of the ridge, and the natural exit for all that water was Fire Road 9, which sloped gently down toward the creek on the other side of the subdivision. But Fire Road 9 was now a dam. The hero put on his rain slicker over his denim vest and walked out into the storm. The rain was deafening, hammering against the metal roof of the barn and turning the dust into slick, treacherous mud. He walked toward the gate, the water already ankle-deep and moving fast. When he reached the boundary, the scene was catastrophic. The water, rushing down from the high ridge where the massive houses of sovereign estates sat, was hitting the new berm of rocks and concrete gate footings. Blocked from its natural path, the water was pooling, swirling, and backing up. But it wasn't backing up into the subdivision was elevated. It was backing up onto the hero's land. The buffer zone the tyrant had screamed about was rapidly becoming a lake. The hero waded closer, careful to stay outside the 10-foot injunction zone, though the marker stakes were now underwater. He could see the tyrant on the other side, huddled under a massive golf umbrella held by a soaking wet security guard. The tyrant wasn't worried about the water, he was pointing at the hero's flooding field and laughing. But then the physics of the situation shifted. The volume of water coming off the subdivision's paved streets, impermeable surfaces that shed water instantly, was too much. The drainage ditches in the subdivision were full. The water started to rise on the HOA side too, threatening the pristine lawn of the tyrant's backyard. The hero watched as the tyrant's laughter died. The tyrant started yelling at his phone, frantic. Within 20 minutes, a heavy-duty pump truck, the kind used for industrial disasters, roared down the subdivision street. It drove right up to the gate on the HOA side. Two men in yellow slickers jumped out. The tyrant was screaming at them, pointing first at his rising swimming pool and then at the hero's land. The hero realized with a jolt of cold anger what was happening. They weren't going to pump the water into a storm drain. They were going to pump it over the berm. The workers uncoiled massive blue hoses, tossing the intake ends into the flooding swale on the HOA side. Then they dragged the discharge hoses, thick, heavy canvas tubes, and threw them over the top of the gate. The nozzles flopped into the mud on the hero's side. The engines fired up, a roaring diesel mechanical scream that cut through the sound of the rain. A torrent of brown, sludge-filled water erupted from the hoses, shooting onto the hero's property at hundreds of gallons a minute. The tyrant was essentially fire-hosing the hero's land with the subdivision's runoff. The water level on the hero's side began to rise visibly. It crept toward his barn. It crept toward his woodshed. It threatened the foundation of his shop. The hero marched forward, entering the 10-foot zone, ignoring the injunction. He grabbed one of the hoses, intending to throw it back. "Don't touch it," the scream came from the tyrant. He was holding a camera, filming. "That is community emergency equipment. You are violating the injunction. I have the sheriff on the line." The hero froze. He looked at the hose pulsing in his hand, then at the tyrant, then at the flashing lights of a cruiser approaching through the rain on the subdivision side. If he moved the hose, he went to jail. If he went to jail, he couldn't protect the land. The tyrant had weaponized the emergency. He was claiming flood mitigation to drown the hero out. The deputy, the same one from earlier, stepped out into the rain, looking miserable. He shouted over the roar of the pumps that the hero had to step back. The hero shouted back, pointing at the hoses, yelling that they were flooding him out intentionally. The deputy shook his head, shouting that he couldn't determine the hydrology, he just had to enforce the court order regarding the equipment. "Let the civil courts handle the damages," the deputy yelled. "Step back or I have to take you in." The hero dropped the hose. It slapped back into the mud, spewing water toward his boots. He stepped back, retreating to the edge of the 10-foot line. He stood there soaked to the bone, watching his property drown. The water was now shin-deep in his lower pasture. His firewood pile was floating away. The grease and oil from the subdivision streets were creating a rainbow sheen on the rising floodwaters, contaminating his soil. The tyrant stood safe on his side, dry under the umbrella, a look of pure malicious satisfaction on his face. He shouted that this was an act of God and that the HOA wasn't liable for weather events. He pointed his finger at the hero, yelling that maybe now the hero would realize he couldn't win against progress. The pumps roared on, a mechanical heartbeat of destruction. The hero turned and walked back to his barn, the water splashing heavily with every step. He went inside the shop, the water lapping at the concrete slab of the entrance. He looked at his tools, his life's work. He felt a rage so cold it burned, but he forced it down, compressing it into a tight, hard ball in his chest. He couldn't use force, he couldn't use the law was currently blocking him, he was isolated. His money was gone, his road was gone, his land was disappearing under a sea of muddy water. He needed a leverage point that didn't depend on a local judge or a confused deputy. He walked to his desk, ignoring the leak in the roof that had started. He pulled out the old topographic maps again. He looked at the water lines, he looked at the elevation, and then he saw it. A faint dotted line running diagonally across the back of the sovereign estate's property, intersecting directly with the land the tyrant's house sat on. It was labeled U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Federal Wetland Overflow Easement 1954. The hero stopped. He wiped a drop of rain from the map. This wasn't county land. This wasn't HOA land. This was federal jurisdiction. The water they were pumping wasn't just rain, it was displacing a federally protected watershed. And by building that berm, they hadn't just blocked a neighbor, they had altered a Corps of Engineers flood control project. The hero looked out the window at the deluge. The tyrant thought he was using the water as a weapon. He didn't realize he was drowning himself in federal felonies. The pumps kept roaring, but the hero wasn't listening to them anymore. He was listening to the sound of the trap snapping shut. He reached for his phone, his wet gloves smearing the screen. He didn't call the lawyer. He didn't call the bank. He dialed the number for the regional field office of the Army Corps of Engineers. It was a long shot. It was a nuclear option. But as he watched the dirty water inch closer to his vintage truck, he knew the time for half measures was over. The crisis had peaked. The HOA had escalated from nuisance to destruction. They wanted a fight over water. He would give them the entire ocean. The hero spoke into the phone, his voice steady as granite. "I need to report a tampering with federal flood control infrastructure in progress. Code red." He hung up and sat in the dark shop, illuminated only by the flashes of lightning, watching the enemy pumps run, waiting for the inevitable collapse of the tyrant's kingdom. The water was rising, but so was the bill, and the currency was about to change from dollars to prison time. The storm had vanished as quickly as it had arrived, replaced by a punishing, radiant sun that scorched the valley with a vengeance, baking the wet earth into a hard, cracked mosaic of mud and debris. The air was thick with the humidity of evaporation, a visible shimmer rising from the ground, distorting the horizon where the blue sky met the jagged line of the pine forest. The hero stood in the center of his lower pasture, the mud caking his heavy biker boots, his sleeveless denim vest stained with the grime of recovery work, the faded tattoos on his arms flexing as he hauled a waterlogged log out of the drainage ditch. He paused to wipe sweat from his brow, adjusting the bandana tied tight around his forehead, his motorcycle gloves slick with mud and oil. The damage was extensive. The buffer zone the HOA had flooded was a wreck of silt, plastic debris from the subdivision, and oily residue from the street runoff, but the water had receded enough to reveal the true extent of the violation. The silence of the morning was heavy, broken only by the sound of the hero's breathing and the distant, buzzing hum of landscaping equipment from the sovereign estate's side, where life continued with an infuriating normalcy. The tyrant was already out, standing on the dry, elevated side of the gate, inspecting the rock berm that had caused the devastation. He wore his signature beige suit miraculously spotless, his beige coat unbuttoned to reveal a crisp white dress shirt that seemed to repel the dust of the real world. He was pointing at the hero, laughing as he spoke to a man in a polo shirt next to him, likely a board member, gesturing to the flooded land as if it were a successful renovation project. The hero didn't engage, he didn't look up. He knew that any reaction would be used against him in court, recorded by the security cameras that were now trained on his property like gun barrels. He kept working, his movements slow, deliberate, and calm. He was waiting. The call he had made the night before had been brief, specific, and terrifyingly serious, but the wheels of federal intervention turned at their own pace. The hero trusted the process not because he believed in the system's benevolence, but because he believed in its territorial aggression. He moved to his truck, retrieving a shovel to clear the intake of the culvert, his back to the gate. That was when the vibration started. It wasn't the rumble of a single truck or the siren of a deputy's cruiser. It was a low-frequency tremor that traveled through the ground, shaking the puddles of standing water. The hero stopped, leaning on his shovel. He looked toward the county highway. A convoy was approaching, but it wasn't local. Turning onto the gravel of Fire Road 9 was a procession of white, heavy-duty SUVs, Chevrolet Suburbans with dark tints, and no markings other than the small, blue government plates and the seal of the Department of Defense on the doors. Behind them came a massive, three-axle truck carrying a piece of equipment that looked like a drilling rig combined with a laboratory. Behind that, a flatbed hauling a dual-track amphibious survey vehicle. The convoy didn't stop at the hero's property line. It didn't slow down for the ruts. It rolled with the inexorable weight of the federal government, bypassing the hero's house and driving straight up to the gate. The lead SUV crunched to a halt inches from the rock berm. The doors of the vehicles opened in unison. Men stepped out. These were not local deputies or private security guards. These were men in gray field uniforms, hard hats, and high-visibility vests stamped with U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. They moved with a synchronized efficiency, ignoring the hero, ignoring the tyrant, focused entirely on the terrain. The lead officer, a man with a gray buzzcut and a face carved from granite, walked directly to the rock pile. He held a ruggedized tablet in one hand and a high-accuracy GPS rod in the other. He placed the rod on the center of the berm, waited for a beep, and then looked at the tablet. He frowned. The tyrant, seeing this invasion of his private domain, immediately sprang into action. He marched to the bars of the gate, his face turning a mottled red, and began to scream. He pointed his finger aggressively through the bars, shouting that this was a private gated community and that they were trespassing on sovereign estates' land. He yelled that he was the president of the board and that no work vehicles were allowed without a permit issued by his office. He demanded they reverse immediately or he would call the sheriff to have them arrested. The lead officer didn't even look up from his tablet. He gestured to two of his men who began unspooling yellow tape. But it wasn't police line tape. It was tape that read Federal Investigation Area, keep out. The tyrant's screaming reached a fever pitch. He rattled the gate, his beige suit jacket flapping as he gestured wildly at the no trespassing signs bolted to the steel. He shouted that he had an injunction, a court order from a judge that protected this perimeter. He pulled a folded copy of the restraining order from his pocket and waved it at the federal agents. The lead officer finally looked up. He walked slowly to the gate, stopping just out of arm's reach of the tyrant. He didn't shout, he didn't posture. He spoke with a voice that was quiet, flat, and absolute. He identified himself as a senior enforcement officer for the Army Corps of Engineers Regulatory Division. He informed the tyrant that under Section 404 of the Clean Water Act and the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1899, the obstruction of a navigable waterway or its tributaries without a federal permit was a felony. The tyrant laughed, a hysterical, disbelief-laden sound. He pointed at the muddy ditch behind the hero. He yelled that it wasn't a river, it was a ditch, and that the HOA had every right to manage their own drainage. He screamed that he knew the law and that the officer was out of his jurisdiction. The officer looked at the tyrant with the look one might give a bug on a windshield. He explained with dangerous patience that the ditch was a designated tributary connecting to the regional watershed, and more importantly, the land the gate sat on was marked on the 1954 Federal Survey as a flowage easement owned by the United States government for flood control. He tapped the tablet screen. He stated that the easement extended 50 feet into the subdivision. The tyrant froze. His finger, still pointing, wavered slightly. He stammered that the developers had cleared the title, that they owned the land fee simple. The officer shook his head. He signaled to the team with the amphibious vehicle. The massive machine roared to life, its tracks clanking as it rolled off the trailer. It drove right past the hero, crushing the mud, and approached the rock berm. The tyrant screamed that they were destroying private property. The officer replied that they were removing an illegal impediment to federal infrastructure. He ordered the tyrant to open it. The tyrant refused, crossing his arms, his face setting into a mask of petulant defiance. He shouted that he had lost the key and that his lawyer was on the way. The officer didn't argue. He turned to a man holding a large, gas-powered abrasive saw. He gave a single nod. The saw roared to life, a high-pitched scream of an engine that drowned out the tyrant's protests. Sparks flew in a massive arc, bright orange against the sunlight, as the blade bit into the heavy steel hinges of the gate. The tyrant scrambled back, shielding his beige suit from the sparks, screaming about lawsuits and damages. The hero watched from his spot by the truck, his arms crossed, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. He lit a cigarette, the smoke curling up into the still air. This was the turning point. The local courts could be bought, the local deputies could be pressured, but the Army Corps of Engineers answered only to the Department of Defense and the physics of water. The saw cut through the top hinge with a loud clang, the gate sagging visibly. Then the bottom hinge, the heavy steel barrier, the symbol of the HOA's power, groaned and twisted. The amphibious vehicle nudged it, and with a screech of tearing metal, the gate fell flat onto the asphalt on the HOA side. The barrier was gone, but the agents weren't done. The officer walked over the fallen gate, stepping onto the pristine asphalt of Sovereign Estates. He walked right up to the tyrant, who was now frantically dialing on his cell phone, his face pale. The officer handed him a document. It wasn't a citation. It was a cease and desist order and a notice of violation. The officer explained that the preliminary survey indicated that not only was the gate illegal, but the grading of the entire Phase 4 expansion, where the tyrant's house stood, appeared to have filled in a federally protected wetland. He pointed to the tyrant's house. He stated that the foundation of that home might be sitting on stolen federal land. The tyrant dropped his phone. It clattered on the pavement. He looked at his house, then at the officer, then at the hero. The power dynamic had inverted in the span of 10 minutes. The hero wasn't the defendant anymore. He was the witness to a federal crime scene. The officer turned to the hero, acknowledging him for the first time. He asked if the hero was the one who called in the report. The hero nodded, his face stoic. The officer asked if the pumps the HOA used were still on the premises. The hero pointed to the maintenance yard visible through the now open gateway. The officer spoke into his radio, ordering a seizure of the equipment as evidence in an environmental crime. The tyrant gasped, grabbing the officer's arm. "You can't take our equipment, that belongs to the association." The officer removed the tyrant's hand with a firm, practiced grip, stepping into his space. He warned the tyrant that interfering with a federal agent was a separate felony and that he strongly suggested the tyrant step back. The tyrant stumbled back, hyperventilating, his beige suit now looking like a costume of a dethroned king. Just then another car arrived, a sleek black sedan. A man in a sharp, dark suit stepped out, the HOA's high-priced lawyer. He looked confident, walking briskly toward the chaos, briefcase in hand. He approached the officer, extending a card, starting to speak in the smooth, arrogant tone of a man who wins by billing hours. He mentioned the injunction. He mentioned the county judge. The officer took the card, looked at it, and handed it back. He told the lawyer that federal supremacy superseded any county civil order and that his client was currently the subject of an investigation under the Clean Water Act, with potential fines of $50,000 per day, retroactive to the date of the violation. The lawyer stopped. He looked at the cut gate. He looked at the federal investigation tape. He looked at the amphibious vehicle now driving into the subdivision's decorative pond to take depth samples. The lawyer's face changed from arrogance to calculation. He turned to the tyrant and whispered something urgent. The tyrant screamed, "I don't care, fix it." The lawyer shook his head, stepping away from the tyrant, creating physical distance. He knew a sinking ship when he saw one. The hero watched the lawyer retreat. The cracks were spreading. It wasn't just the gate, the entire legitimacy of the HOA was crumbling. The officer walked back to the hero. He asked about the old maps the hero had mentioned on the phone. The hero walked to his truck and pulled out the file, the 1954 Corps survey, the deed, the historical drainage plats. He handed them to the officer. The officer spread them out on the hood of the hero's truck, weighing the corners down with rocks. He studied them, tracing the lines with a finger. He whistled low. He looked up at the hero and said, "You were right, they didn't just block the easement. They built the main sewer line for the neighborhood right through it." The officer looked at the subdivision. "If that's true, every certificate of occupancy in that row is invalid." The hero said nothing, simply nodding. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of the revelation. The HOA hadn't just bullied a neighbor, they had committed massive real estate fraud. The tyrant was pacing in circles on his driveway, screaming at someone on the phone, his voice cracking. He was pointing at the hero, then at the sky, then at the agents. He looked like a man losing his mind. The officer folded the maps and handed them back to the hero. He told the hero that he would need copies and that the hero should expect a subpoena not as a suspect but as the primary witness for the prosecution. The hero took the maps, his leather gloves crinking. He looked at the gate lying twisted on the ground. He looked at the buffer zone now swarming with federal agents taking soil samples. The justice he had sought was arriving, not with a gavel but with a bulldozer. The officer ordered his team to move the amphibious vehicle further into the subdivision. They were going to survey the tyrant's backyard. The tyrant tried to block the driveway, standing in front of the machine, arms spread wide, a solitary beige figure against the might of the United States government. The machine didn't stop. The operator blasted the horn, a deafening sound that shook the windows of the nearby houses. The tyrant jumped out of the way at the last second, falling into his own manicured shrubs, his suit tearing on the branches. He lay there, sprawling in the dirt, watching the tracks of the vehicle tear up his perfect lawn. The hero watched him fall. There was no joy in it, only the cold satisfaction of gravity doing its work. The hero turned back to his shop. He had cleaning to do. The mud was still deep, but the flow had stopped. The dam was broken. The authority of the HOA had encountered the one thing it couldn't bully, bribe, or sue, the supreme law of the land. As the hero walked into the shadow of his barn, he heard the tyrant screaming one last time, a desperate, wailing sound that was swallowed by the roar of the federal trucks. The crisis was over. The collapse had begun. And the hero, the old biker with the 1978 truck, had just toppled a kingdom without throwing a single punch. The sun beat down, drying the mud, sealing the fate of sovereign estates in the hard, cracked earth. The inevitable collapse of the Sovereign Estates Homeowner Association did not happen with a whimper, but with the deafening roar of diesel engines and the grinding of steel against concrete, a symphony of destruction that echoed through the valley for weeks. The hero stood on his porch, a mug of black coffee in his hand, his sleeveless denim vest catching the morning breeze, his bandana tied tight against the glare of the relentless sun. The scene before him was no longer a standoff, it was a demolition site. The Army Corps of Engineers had not been idle. Once they had confirmed the violation of the federal flowage easement, the machinery of the United States government had shifted from investigation to remediation, a bureaucratic term that meant ripping the offending infrastructure out of the earth by force. The gate, the symbol of the tyrant's petty authority, was long gone, hauled away as scrap metal on a flatbed truck. In its place, the road was being widened, graded, and paved with a heavy-duty aggregate suitable for the 50-ton fire apparatus that the fire marshal had originally mandated. But the roadwork was merely the sideshow. The main event was happening on the other side of the property line, right in the heart of the exclusive cul-de-sac where the tyrant lived. The hero walked down the hill, his heavy biker boots crunching on the soil that was finally drying out after the flood. He stopped at the property line, leaning against a newly installed post that marked the federal easement boundary. The buffer zone the tyrant had tried to enforce was now a construction zone. The USACE had determined that the entire grading plan for Phase 4 of the subdivision had been built on illegal fill, altering the historic watershed and causing the flooding that had nearly drowned the hero's land. The remediation order was absolute: restore the original grade. This meant that thousands of tons of dirt, imported by the developers to create the high scenic ridges for the luxury homes, had to be removed. And sitting squarely on top of that illegal dirt was the tyrant's house. The hero watched as a massive yellow excavator, a machine the size of a dinosaur, crawled across the tyrant's manicured lawn, its tracks tearing up the sod like paper. The operator, a man in a hard hat and safety glasses, manipulated the controls with surgical precision, swinging the massive bucket toward the retaining wall that held up the tyrant's swimming pool. The tyrant was there, of course. He was standing on the sidewalk, or what was left of it, surrounded by a group of angry men, his neighbors. The beige suit was still his uniform, but it looked different now. It was wrinkled, dusty, and hung loosely on his frame, as if the man inside had shrunk under the pressure of the atmosphere. He wasn't yelling anymore, he was pleading. He was gesturing wildly at the excavator, then at the neighbors, then at a man in a dark suit standing near a black sedan, the bank representative. The neighbors, men who had once followed his lead, were now shouting him down. The class action lawsuit had been filed 3 days after the federal raid. When the USACE declared the certificates of occupancy invalid due to the easement violation, the property values in Phase 4 hadn't just dipped, they had evaporated. The homes were unsellable, the mortgages were underwater, and the insurance companies, sensing fraud, had voided the policies ab initio, citing the intentional concealment of federal land use restrictions. The neighbors were looking for a scapegoat, and they had found one in the man in the beige suit who had promised them exclusivity and delivered financial ruin. The hero watched, his face impassive, as the excavator bucket slammed into the concrete retaining wall. Crack. The sound was like a gunshot. The wall gave way and the soil behind it slumped forward. The swimming pool, the crown jewel of the tyrant's backyard, cracked down the center, spilling its chlorinated water into the muddy trench below. The tyrant flinched, turning away, unable to watch the destruction of his kingdom. He looked across the devastation and locked eyes with the hero. There was no defiance left in his gaze, only a hollow, shell-shocked realization of total defeat. The hero didn't smile, he didn't wave. He simply nodded once, a gesture that said, "This is what happens." The legal fallout was just as brutal as the physical demolition. The hero had received a copy of the final judgment in the mail earlier that week. The court had not only dissolved the current HOA board for gross negligence and criminal mismanagement, but it had also pierced the corporate veil. This was the legal maneuver the hero's lawyer had predicted, because the tyrant and his board had acted with malice and intentional disregard for state and federal law. They were not protected by the HOA's liability insurance. The damages, the cost of the USACE remediation, the fines for the Clean Water Act violations, which had totaled nearly $2 million, and the compensation to the hero for the flooding damage were personal liabilities. The tyrant was bankrupt, his assets were frozen. The beige suit was likely the only thing he owned free and clear. The hero turned his attention back to the road. A county truck had pulled up and the fire marshal stepped out. He looked different today, relaxed, holding a rolled-up set of plans. He walked over to the hero, extending a hand. The handshake was firm, the grip of two men who understood that rules existed to keep people alive, not to keep people out. The marshal unrolled the plans on the hood of the hero's truck. He pointed to the new thick black lines on the map. County Road 9, he said, it's official. The county took it back by eminent domain this morning. The judge signed the order. It's a public right-of-way now 50 feet wide, paved and maintained by the state. He looked at the hero. No gates, ever. The hero looked at the map. The easement was permanent. The trap the HOA had built had been dismantled brick by brick. The marshal laughed a low rumble. And the best part, he added, pointing to a clause at the bottom, the cost of the road upgrade is being attached as a tax lien to the remaining lots in sovereign estates. They're paying for your driveway. The hero folded his arms. It was poetic. The very people who wanted to ban his truck were now subsidizing the asphalt it drove on. The marshal rolled up the map and tipped his hat, walking back to his truck. We'll be doing a test run with the ladder truck tomorrow, he called out. Make sure you're clear. The hero nodded. He would be clear. The climax of the afternoon came an hour later. A moving van arrived, but it wasn't a professional line. It was a beat-up rental truck driven by the tyrant himself. He parked it haphazardly on the street, avoiding the piles of debris from his collapsing backyard. He wasn't moving out by choice. The bank had foreclosed. The notice had been taped to his front door for 3 days, property seized by Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. The tyrant began hauling boxes out of the front door alone. There were no movers, no friends, no supportive board members. Just a man in a dusty beige suit carrying the remnants of his life to a rental truck while the neighbors watched from their driveways with cold, crossed arms. The hero decided to walk up to the boundary one last time. He stood on the edge of the new public road 10 feet from the tyrant's driveway. The tyrant came out with a box of files, likely the HOA records he had tried to weaponize. He saw the hero. He stopped. The sun beat down on them, harsh and unforgiving. The tyrant dropped the box on the asphalt. He looked at the hero, his face a mask of red, pressurized anger, though he remained dry, his rage burning him from the inside out. He pointed a shaking finger at the hero, but the gesture lacked the power it once had. You ruined this, the tyrant hissed, his voice raspy. You and your junk piles, we had a vision here. The hero looked at the man, really looked at him. He saw a man who had mistaken a property deed for a crown. You didn't have a vision, the hero said, his voice gravelly and calm. You had a map and you didn't read it. The tyrant opened his mouth to scream, to launch one final tirade about property values and aesthetics, but the sound of the excavator drowned him out. The machine had finished with the pool and was now tearing into the sunroom of the house. Glass shattered, wood splintered, the structure was compromised. The federal order demanded the removal of the encroachment, and the encroachment was the house itself. The tyrant flinched at the sound, looking back at his crumbling home. He realized finally that there was no appeal. He picked up his box of files and shuffled to the rental truck, throwing it in the back. He climbed into the cab, the engine sputtering as he turned it on. He didn't look back. He put the truck in gear and drove away, navigating through the construction equipment, a defeated exile in a beige suit leaving the kingdom he had destroyed. The hero watched the truck disappear around the bend. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the heavy, tense silence of the standoff. It was the natural, open silence of the land. The buzzing of the drone was gone. The security guard was gone. The landscaping crews were gone. All that remained was the rhythmic thud crunch of the remediation crew restoring the earth to its natural state. The hero walked back to his barn. He went inside and opened the safe where he kept his important papers. He took out the file labeled HOA dispute. He didn't need it anymore. He tossed it into the burn barrel outside. He then took out a check that had arrived that morning from his lawyer's office. It was the settlement payout from the tyrant's liquidated assets. It was enough to buy a new tractor, pave his own driveway, and still have enough left over to pay his property taxes for the next 20 years. He folded the check and put it in his pocket. He walked over to his 1978 pickup, the truck that had started the whole war. He patted the hood. It was time to get back to work. There was wood to split. There were fences to mend. But first, there was one final piece of business. The hero walked to the edge of his property where the old no trespassing signs of the HOA had been posted. They were lying in the dirt, knocked over by the construction crews. The hero picked one up. It read private property violators prosecuted. He walked it over to the new steel post the county had installed, the one holding the green sign that said County RD9 Public Access. He leaned the broken plastic sign against the post, a tombstone for a dead idea. He turned his back on the subdivision, on the ruins of the tyrant's house, and on the wreckage of the exclusive community. He looked out over his 60 acres, the pine trees swaying in the wind, the hawk circling overhead. The land was whole again. The water flowed freely in the creek. The road was open. The hero took a deep breath of the pine-scented air. He had held the line, he had fought the war, and he had won. He walked back toward his house, the sun setting behind him, casting a long shadow that stretched across the land he owned, the land he protected, and the land that in the end had fought back alongside him. The story was over. The silence was his.